If the garbage wants to eat, it can eat from the dumpster. 6 staff members heard him say it, standing inches from a starving woman on her knees. Tyler Brooks, heir to a $10 billion trust, owned the building, the staff, and apparently the air she breathed. Rachel didn't flinch. I just need 5 more minutes with him. 5 minutes for what's scrubbing his drool. Tyler crushed the toast under his $4,000 shoe, grinding it into the linoleum. Rachel watched the crumbs scatter, then looked past him to the yellow drip hanging beside the wheelchair. She reached into her cart, pulled out a worn leather notebook, and
Damn, he just handed his own executioner the exact weapon she needed to dismantle his empire. Let me take you back.
the fluorescent lights of Terminal 4 flickered. They buzzed. They did what dying things do. They held on just long enough to make you notice. At 12:07 a.m., Sarah Mitchell pushed her mop bucket down the center of Concourse C. The wheels squealed against the polished tile. She didn't wince at the sound anymore. She had stopped wincing at a lot of things. Her sneakers were canvas, frayed, waterlogged canvas. The left sole had separated at the toe, and she had fixed it with a strip of duct tape 2 weeks ago. The tape was peeling now. Everything she owned was always peeling, always one bad shift away from falling apart completely. But she pushed. She always pushed. Her apron sagged on her left side. The pocket held a crumpled napkin from the coffee shop on Terminal 2's lower level. She hadn't bought coffee. She had found the napkin on a table clean enough and pocketed it out of habit. The habit of a woman who knew that nothing was truly disposable when you had nothing to spare. By midnight, the terminal was hers. Empty, silent, entirely hers. No passengers, no gate agents. No one to look through her like she was part of the furniture. She liked these hours. She hated that she liked them because liking them meant she had gotten used to being invisible. She wrung the mop. Gray water splashed back into the bucket. The smell was industrial. Bleach and floor grime and something faintly sweet that she had never been able to identify in 3 years of work in this shift. She didn't try to identify it anymore. She was thinking about her son, Marcus, 7 years old, asleep right now at her sister's apartment across town. Her sister charged her $200 a month for the overnight sitting. $200 she didn't have. $200 she paid anyway because Marcus was the one thing in her life she refused to let fall apart. The squeak of her bucket wheels, the hum of the lights, the low-pressurized breath of the HVAC system overhead. These were her sounds, her world between midnight and 6. She didn't hear the elevator open. She heard the shoes. Italian leather on polished tile makes a very specific sound. Precise, expensive, sharp. The sound of a man who has never once in his adult life worried about the price of anything. She registered it before she registered him. The shoes arrived first. They always did with men like that. Donald Sterling was not a tall man. He was the kind of man who had compensated for that his entire life, and the compensation was visible in everything. The cut of his suit, the set of his jaw, the way he moved through space as though it owed him passage. His tie was silk. His watch caught the fluorescent light and threw it back like an insult. $50,000 on his wrist. Sarah knew what that watch cost because she had once cleaned the display case at the Rolex boutique in Terminal 1's duty-free zone, and she had read the price tag because she was a human being, and human beings look at things they will never own. He was moving fast, late for something, or pretending to be. Men like Donald Sterling were always moving fast towards something that mattered only to them. He didn't look at her. He didn't see her. She was part of the floor, part of the bucket, part of the infrastructure of the building he passed through without acknowledging. His loafer connected with the side of her mop bucket. Not a bump, not an accident, a shove. Deliberate, contemptuous, the way a man kicks something out of his path when he cannot be bothered to walk around it. The bucket went over. The sound was enormous in the empty terminal. A hard plastic crack against the tile, and then the rush of dirty gray water spreading fast across the floor. It hit Sarah's feet before she could move. It soaked through the canvas in half a second. Cold, shockingly cold. She felt it in her socks. She felt it between her toes. She gasped. She couldn't help it. Donald Sterling laughed. A short, flat sound. Not a laugh of surprise. a laugh of satisfaction. "Watch where you park that thing," he said. He didn't stop walking. He adjusted his watch, a quick reflexive gesture the way a man checks a weapon is still holstered, and kept moving toward the VIP elevators at the far end of the concourse. Sarah stood in the puddle. She stood very still, her jaw locked, her hands tightened on the mop handle. Cold water continued spreading around her feet, finding the grout lines in the tile moving outward in every direction the way damage always does. 10 feet away, Officer Matthew Sullivan stood at his post. He had seen everything. He had heard everything. His hand rested on his belt. His eyes moved to Sarah, then to Donald's retreating back, then down to his own shoes. He said nothing. He did nothing. He became part of the wall. Sarah watched Donald Sterling walk toward the VIP elevators. She watched his hand press the call button without breaking stride. She watched him step inside, turn to face the closing doors, and in that last half second, she was almost certain she watched him smile. The doors closed. He was gone. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the crumpled coffee shop napkin. She pressed it against her face. Damp, tired hands. Damp, tired face. The napkin smelled faintly of old coffee and counter cleaner. She held it there for 3 seconds. Then she folded it carefully and put it back in her pocket. Matthew was still staring at the floor. "You going to help me with this?" Sarah said. He cleared his throat. "I didn't see anything," he said. "I know," she said. She went to get the mop. It was 12:14 a.m. She had 5 hours and 46 minutes left on her shift. She had $37 in her checking account. She had a son asleep across town who believed his mother could fix anything. She cleaned up the water. She moved slowly, methodically, the way she moved through everything. Not because she wasn't angry, but because anger uncontrolled cost too much. It cost energy she didn't have. It cost time she couldn't buy back. But her mind was doing something else entirely. Her mind was replaying the moment the bucket went over. The direction it fell. The sound of it. The deliberate heel-to-plastic contact of a $50,000 shoe against the cheapest piece of equipment in the building. A man who had somewhere to be in the middle of the night. A man moving fast. A man who had come from somewhere from a terminal that was closed, condemned, and completely dark. She wrung the mop again. Gray water ran back into the bucket in thin ropes. Terminal 4. He had come from Terminal 4. Nobody came from Terminal 4. It was under renovation, stripped to the concrete bones, sealed off with orange barriers and yellow caution tape since March. No passengers. No staff. No lights. She looked down the concourse toward the heavy fire door at the far end, the door that connected to Terminal 4's lower wing. It was 12:19 a.m. She reached into her apron and touched the heavy brass ring of maintenance keys clipped to her belt loop. Every door in this airport, every service corridor, every utility room, every locked gate, and every terminal, condemned or otherwise. Her fingers found the right key from muscle memory alone. She looked at Matthew. He was watching the middle distance, performing the act of not being there. She picked up her bucket. She moved toward the fire door. She didn't know what she was going to find. She didn't know that the man she had just watched walk away was in the process of stealing an empire. She didn't know that the key on her ring would open the only door in the building that mattered tonight. She didn't know any of it. But something was wrong in that dark terminal. She had learned in 34 years of being ignored by people with expensive shoes to trust the feeling that something was wrong. Her duct-taped sneaker pushed through the fire door. The cold hit her instantly, the kind of cold that had no business in an enclosed building. The kind of cold that meant something had been abandoned and had been abandoned for a long time. In the dark, she heard breathing. Donald thought he had buried whatever this was in the dark. He had not once considered that seeds grow in the dark. He had not once considered the woman with the mop and the keys and the napkin still folded in her pocket. He would. The fire door swung shut behind her. The sound it made was final. Thick, heavy, metallic. The sound of a decision becoming permanent. Sarah stood still. She let her eyes adjust. The terminal was not completely black. Emergency exit signs burned red at the far ends of the concourse, dim and distant, painting the gutted space in a color that felt wrong. The renovation had stripped everything. Gone were the gate chairs, the overhead screens, the carpet. What remained was raw concrete, exposed wiring bundled in orange conduit, and the skeletal framing of walls that hadn't been built yet. It smelled like cold dust, like a building in the process of forgetting it had ever been used. She held her flashlight up. The beam cut through the dark in a pale yellow column. She swept it left. Construction barriers, plastic sheeting, a collapsed sawhorse tipped on its side, one leg broken. She swept it right. The beam found the wheelchair. It was expensive. Even from 30 feet away, even in the dark, she could tell. High-tech medical grade, the kind with a motorized base and a joystick control panel on the right armrest, the kind that cost more than she made in a year. It sat in the middle of the concourse, motionless, facing the dark wall of glass that had once been a row of departure windows. The man in it wasn't moving. Sarah walked toward him, fast but controlled. Her wet sneakers made soft sucking sounds on the concrete. Her flashlight beam bounced with each step. When she was 10 feet away, she stopped. He was old, 70, maybe older, white-haired, with the kind of face that had once been sharp and commanding, and was now drawn thin by something beyond age. He wore a cashmere coat, charcoal gray, the kind of coat that cost more than her car. His hands were folded in his lap. His eyes were open. He was awake. He was shaking. "Sir," Sarah said. He turned his head slowly. The movement cost him something. She could see it in his jaw and the controlled way he drew breath before he spoke. "I didn't think anyone would come," he said. His voice was steady, measured. A man trained over a lifetime to sound in control even when he was not. "How long have you been here?" Sarah asked. He considered the question. "Since 11, he said. "Perhaps a little before, more than an hour." In an unheated, gutted terminal with no lights and a wheelchair with a dead battery in the middle of the night, Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. Not pity exactly, something older and angrier than pity. "The battery," she said, nodding at the joystick panel. The small indicator light was dark, completely dark. "It died approximately 40 minutes after I was left here," he said. "I've been sitting with that fact for some time now." Sarah unslung the thermos from her apron strap. Cheap, scratched a gas station thermos she had owned for 4 years. She held it out to him. He looked at it. Something moved across his face. Surprise, she thought. The genuine kind, the kind a person shows when they receive something they weren't prepared to want. "It's instant," she said. "And it's lukewarm, but it's hot enough to matter." He took it with both hands. His grip was weak on the left side, stronger on the right. He drank, not a polite sip, a real drink. Long, slow eyes closed. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it the way people only mean things when they have been sitting alone in the cold long enough to remember what things are actually worth. Sarah crouched down to his eye level. Her knees protested. She ignored them. "Who left you here?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that isn't hesitation. The kind that is a man deciding how much truth to hand to a stranger in the dark. "My son," he said. Sarah said nothing. She waited. "His name is Donald," he said. "Donald Sterling. I am Henry Sterling. I founded Vanguard Aviation 31 years ago." He paused. He looked at the dark windows. This morning, there is a board meeting at 10 o'clock. A proxy vote. If I am present, I control the vote. If I am not present, my son controls it." He stopped. He turned back to her. "He intends to liquidate the company's pension fund. 4,000 employees. Retirement savings they have spent careers building. He intends to redirect the assets into a private holding structure that benefits himself alone." Sarah sat with that. She sat with the weight of it. "And he left you here," she said, "to make sure you couldn't stop him." "Yes," Henry said, simply, without drama. The way a man states a fact he has had time to accept and has not yet decided whether to survive. The bone-deep draft moved through the terminal again. Sarah felt it on her neck, on her forearms. She looked at Henry's hands still wrapped around her thermos, still shaking, not from fear, from cold and from something beyond cold. The particular tremor of a body that has been sitting helpless for over an hour with nothing to do but think about what its own blood had done to it. "I need to get you out of here," Sarah said. "The elevators are locked," Henry said. Donald would have initiated the corporate protocol the moment he left. VIP elevator access restricted. He has the authority to do it remotely. He looked at her. "I don't know how we get to the boardroom in time. I don't know that we can." "Can I borrow your pen?" Sarah said. He blinked. He reached into his inner coat pocket and produced a pen. Matte black heavy, the kind of pen that signs things that matter. He held it out. Sarah reached into her apron and pulled out the crumpled coffee shop napkin. She smoothed it against her knee. She held it flat. "Write down the name," she said, "of the one person who stopped." Henry looked at her for a long moment. Then he uncapped the pen. His right hand was steadier now. He wrote. He wrote carefully, deliberately, the way a man writes something he intends to stand behind. He handed the napkin back. Sarah looked at it. She folded it once, twice. She put it in her apron pocket. "Okay," she said. She stood. Her knees burned. Her socks were still wet. She had $36 and some change in her checking account, a son asleep across town, and a supervisor who had already radioed her twice in the last 20 minutes. She looked at the brass ring of keys on her belt. She looked at Henry. "There's a service door," she said, "at the south end of this terminal. It connects to the underground maintenance tunnels. The baggage system runs through them. They go under the whole airport." She paused. "Including under the executive tower." Henry Sterling had built this airport. He had signed every contract approved, every blueprint overseen, every phase of its construction. And he looked at Sarah Mitchell, a graveyard shift janitor in duct-taped sneakers holding a gas station thermos, with the expression of a man who has just understood something important about what he had missed. "You know a way," he said. "I know every way," she said. "I clean them all." She gripped the handles of his wheelchair. Dead battery. Dead motor. 300 pounds of chair and man on cold concrete in the dark. She was risking her job for a stranger. She knew that. She had known it the moment she pushed through the fire door. What she did not know, what she could not have known standing in the cold dark of Terminal 4, was that the stranger owned the floor she was standing on. She started to push. "One more thing," Henry said quietly as they moved. "Yeah," Sarah said. "I don't know your name," she told him. He nodded once, the way a man nods when he is filing something away in a place where he keeps things he intends to remember. In a building full of people who had never once looked at her, Henry Sterling looked at her. She didn't have time to think about what that meant. The service door was 40 feet ahead. The tunnels were below. The board meeting was 9 hours and 40 minutes away. She pushed. The service door at the south end of Terminal 4 opened on the third key. Sarah counted them by feel alone. 22 keys on the brass ring, each one a different weight, a different cut, a different room in a building most people only ever saw the surface of. She had learned them in her first 6 months. She knew them now the way she knew her son's face in the dark. The door opened. She pushed Henry through. They were back in the lower connector corridor. Dim, functional, fluorescent lit. The kind of hallway that existed to be used and never admired. A stretch of beige wall scuffed at wheelchair height from years of equipment carts and a row of electrical panels bolted to the left side at intervals of 10 feet. The VIP elevator bank was 60 feet ahead. Sarah pushed faster. The wheelchair moved well on the smooth corridor floor, better than it had on the rough concrete of Terminal 4. Henry sat straight. His hands rested in his lap. His breathing had steadied, helped by the lukewarm coffee, and Sarah suspected by the simple fact of moving towards something instead of sitting still inside something that could not be changed. The elevator bank came into view. 4 doors. Brushed steel recessed into a panel of dark granite. Above each door, a small digital display showed the current floor. All 4 displays were red. Sarah stopped the wheelchair. She stared at the panel. Red in this building meant one thing. She had seen it twice before in 3 years. Once during a security drill, and once during a bomb threat that turned out to be a forgotten suitcase. She stepped forward anyway. She pressed the call button. The panel above the button lit up. Not the warm amber of a normal call. A flat, cold red. 2 words on the small screen in clean white capital letters. Access denied. Henry said nothing. He had known. Of course he had known. His son had walked out of that terminal, and somewhere between the VIP lounge and whatever car was waiting for him had picked up a phone and made one call. Corporate lockdown, executive authority, remotely initiated, remotely controlled, and completely airtight. Sarah pressed the button again. The screen repeated itself. Access denied. She stepped back. She looked at the 4 steel doors, unmoved and indifferent. She looked at the dark granite panel. She looked at the access denied display glowing red in the empty corridor like a small, confident verdict. Her radio crackled. The sound was brutal in the silence. Harsh, buzzing static that cut through the corridor and bounced off every flat surface before resolving into a voice. Darnell, her supervisor. His voice carried the particular tone of a man who had already decided something and was calling to inform her of it, not to discuss it. Mitchell. Static. Mitchell, I've got your location on the board and you are not in your zone. You want to tell me what you're doing in the South Connector? Sarah unclipped the radio. She held it in her hand. She looked at Henry. Henry looked back at her. His expression was composed, careful, and entirely without expectation. He was not asking her for anything. He had made no demands. He had explained his situation and accepted her help, and he was right now prepared to accept whatever she decided with the same dignity he had brought to sitting alone in the cold dark for over an hour. That was the thing that made the decision for her, not the pension fund, not the 4,000 employees she had never met. Not even the anger still burning low and clean in her chest, left over from a bucket of dirty water and a $50,000 watch catching the light as it walked away. It was the dignity, the refusal to beg. She clipped the radio back to her apron strap without answering. The static crackled again. Darnell's voice sharper now. Mitchell, I'm going to need a response. You've got outstanding cleaning orders in Concourse B, and I've had 2 complaints from the Night Gate team. You copy. She looked at the access denied panel. She looked at her key ring. Then she turned around. There's something I want to show you, she said to Henry. She pushed the wheelchair back the way they had come, but not all the way. 40 feet back down the connector corridor where the beige wall made a shallow jog to the left, there was a door. It was not marked. It was not on the map posted in the break room. It was not on the digital floor plan available on the airport's staff intranet system. It was rusted at the hinges, and at the base of the frame, the way things rust when they have been in contact with moisture for a decade, and no one has been tasked with maintaining them because no one in a position to care knows they exist. Sarah found the right key. 4th from the end of the ring, a shorter key older than the others, brass gone dull from years of non-use. She had found this door 18 months ago during a solo deep clean of the connector corridor. She had unlocked it out of curiosity. She had stood at the top of the stairs behind it and felt the cold exhaust-laced air rising from below. She had noted it, filed it in the part of her memory reserved for things that might one day be useful, and moved on. She unlocked it now. The lock was stiff. It gave. The door swung inward. The smell came first. Stale air and industrial exhaust and the faint metallic bite of conveyor belt grease. Then the dark. Deep, steep industrial dark broken only by the distant orange glow of safety lighting at the bottom of a long concrete staircase. The underground baggage tunnels. Henry leaned forward slightly in the chair. He looked down the stairs. The executives don't know these exist, Sarah said. It was not a boast. It was a statement of simple fact. They moved through the building through the parts that were designed to be seen. Lobbies, elevators, corridors with carpet and signage. She paused. She looked down the stairs. Nobody designs the basement for the people who run the building. They design it for the people who work in it. Henry was quiet. Then carefully he said, "How far do the tunnels run?" "Under every terminal," Sarah said. "Under the connector bridges, under the executive tower." She gripped the wheelchair handles, "Including under the boardroom." Henry looked at the stairs. He looked at the darkness below. He looked at the staircase that was narrow and steep and designed for maintenance workers moving on foot, not for a man in a dead 300-pound wheelchair. "That's a difficult descent," he said. "Yes," Sarah said. The radio crackled again, Darnell's voice flat and final, now the performance of patience completely gone. "Mitchell, you do not respond by the time I finish the sentence. I am pulling your badge. You copy last call." Sarah reached down. She unclipped the radio from her apron strap. She held it for 1 second. She set it down on the floor of the corridor gently, the way you set down something you were choosing to leave behind. She looked at Henry. "Hold on to the armrests," she said. She tilted the wheelchair back onto its rear wheels. She aligned it with the top of the staircase. She felt the weight of it shift into her arms, into her shoulders, into the muscles of her lower back that already ached from 6 hours of mop work. Her job was behind her now, officially, irrevocably behind her. The staircase was below. The tunnels were below. The boardroom was somewhere above the tunnels, 9 floors up and 40 minutes away by route only she knew existed. Donald Sterling had locked every front door in the building. He had locked them carefully, deliberately, with corporate authority and digital certainty. He had thought about the elevators. He had thought about the lobby. He had thought about every point of access visible to a man who had only ever moved through the building like a passenger. He had not thought about the basement. He had not thought about who controls the basement. Sarah Mitchell took the first step down.
Wait. He just locked his own paralyzed father in a freezing terminal to steal his company. If that were me, my hands would be shaking with rage. Imagine sitting helpless in that wheelchair while your own blood betrays you. The audacity is real.
The first step down was the hardest, not because of the weight, because of the commitment. After that, there was only the work. Sarah went slowly, deliberately. Both hands locked on the wheelchair handles, arms fully extended, the weight of the chair and the man pressing forward into her grip with every inch of descent. She had tilted the chair back onto its rear wheels to keep Henry from pitching forward. It meant the full load transferred directly into her wrists, her forearms, her shoulders. She felt it immediately. She ignored it immediately. 1 step, control. 1 step, control. The staircase was 12 steps. She counted them. Not because she needed to, but because counting gave the mind something to do that wasn't panic. At the bottom, she set the front wheels down. She exhaled. Her breath came out white in the cold air below ground. She hadn't expected that. The cold down here was different from the cold in Terminal 4. That cold had been the cold of abandonment of a space left open to the night. This cold was the cold of depth. Old, pressurized, subterranean cold that the sun had never once reached and never would. She looked ahead. The tunnel ran long and straight, lit at intervals by caged orange safety lights bolted to the ceiling every 30 feet. Between the lights, the dark was heavy. The ceiling was low, 8 feet, maybe 8.5, and the walls were raw. Poured concrete marked with decades of scuff lines and grease transfers from equipment carts and baggage trolleys. On the right side, a conveyor belt system ran the full length of the tunnel on a raised metal frame, currently still and dark. The belt smelled of machine oil and rubber and something else underneath, the smell of 10,000 bags passing through on their way to somewhere else. The floor was smooth but not clean. Grease in dark spreading maps across the concrete, grit, a scatter of plastic zip ties and cardboard fragments. The tunnel turned left at the far end, perhaps 200 feet ahead, and disappeared. Sarah pushed. The wheelchair moved differently down here. The floor resistance was higher. Small debris caught in the wheels and had to be rolled over rather than around. She leaned into the handles and drove with her legs the way she moved the industrial floor buffer on the night shift. Weight forward momentum doing the work her arms couldn't sustain alone. Henry was silent. He held both armrests. His cashmere coat, charcoal gray and previously immaculate, was collecting the tunnel in thin, dark smears. A grease transfer on the left lapel, concrete dust on the shoulders, the right sleeve catching a streak of something dark as they passed a junction box on the wall. The coat had probably cost $4,000. It was earning a new history now down here in the dark, in a place where $4,000 was an abstraction so remote it barely qualified as a number. Sarah's fingernails were tearing, not all at once, one at a time, catching on the rubber grip of the wheelchair handles as her hands shifted and repositioned with each push. The middle finger on her right hand had gone first back on the staircase, now the index finger on her left. Small, clean tears at the corner of the nail bed. She felt each one as a brief, specific sting, and then the sting folded into the general burn of her hands and was lost. She didn't mention it. There was nothing to mention. "You've worked here 3 years," Henry said. His voice was steady, calibrated to carry without echoing too badly in the concrete space. 3 years and 4 months, Sarah said. She didn't break stride. Night shift the entire time. "Only shift I could get with a child," she said. "Daycare doesn't run at midnight. My sister sits him. She charges me for it." A pause, a push. "Worth it." Henry was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What's his name?" "More Marcus," Sarah said. 7. He wants to be a pilot." She almost smiled. Almost. "I don't tell him what the airport actually pays the people who keep it running." Henry said nothing to that. She felt him absorb it the way a man absorbs a fact he has been insulated from for a long time and is now receiving it directly without buffer. The tunnel curved left. They followed it. On the other side of the curve, the path angled upward. Gradual at first, then steeper. Sarah had known the incline was coming. She had walked this tunnel twice before, both times on foot, both times going downhill. Going downhill with no load is not the same thing as going uphill with 300 pounds. She found out immediately. The first 10 feet of incline were manageable. The next 10 were harder. The 10 after that were something else entirely. A grinding full-body resistance that moved from her calves up through her thighs and settled into her lower back as a bright, sustained burn. She shortened her steps. She drove harder with her heels. She bent lower over the handles and pushed from her hips rather than her shoulders, which was better biomechanically and still brutally hard. Her calves were on fire, her lower back was on fire, her torn fingernails screamed every time her grip shifted. She pushed. The incline was 30 degrees. At least. Maybe more. The ceiling lowered slightly as the floor rose, compressing the space, making the tunnel feel narrower than it was. The orange safety lights were farther apart up here. The dark between them was longer. She pushed through the dark. She pushed through the light. She pushed through the next dark. "You can rest," Henry said quietly, "if you need to." "I don't need to," Sarah said. She said it without anger, without performance. A flat statement of fact delivered to the concrete ahead of her. Henry reached into his inner coat pocket. Slowly, carefully, with the deliberateness of a man performing a significant act in a difficult moment, he drew out the folded napkin. The coffee shop napkin, ink-stained now, where his signature had bled slightly into the thin paper. He looked at it. He folded it once more tightly, precisely. He tucked it back into the pocket. He pressed his hand flat against it once, the way you press your hand against something you need to know is still there. Sarah saw the gesture in her peripheral vision. She said nothing, but she registered it. The way she registered everything down here, with the full, quiet attention of a woman who had spent 3 years learning that the things nobody looks at are usually the things that matter most. The incline leveled. She felt it in her legs before she understood it consciously. The resistance dropping, the push becoming easier by degrees, the burn in her calves downgrading from fire to heat to ache. Flat ground. She stopped. She straightened up. She pressed both fists into the small of her back and held the pressure there for 3 seconds. Above them, somewhere through 9 floors of steel and concrete, a boardroom was being arranged. Chairs, water glasses, a polished mahogany table long enough to seat 20. A presentation deck loaded and ready. Legal documents tabbed and stacked. A pen uncapped waiting for a signature. Sarah looked at the tunnel ahead. One more junction. One more staircase. A service door at the top that she had never opened from this side, but that her key ring told her she could. "How far?" Henry said. "Close," Sarah said. She gripped the handles again. Her hands were stiff, sore torn, tightened by cold into something that barely resembled the hands she'd had at midnight. She pushed. Her muscles were screaming. Her job was gone. Her radio sat on a corridor floor 18 minutes behind her. She wasn't stopping, not for the pain, not for the dark, not for the 30-degree concrete incline that had just tried to take her apart and failed. Not for the supervisor whose last call she had left unanswered on a beige hallway floor. Not for anything. She thought about Marcus. 7 years old, asleep, still at her sister's apartment, dreaming maybe about planes, about altitude, about the view from somewhere high enough that the ground below looks clean and ordered and fair. She pushed toward the staircase at the end of the tunnel. She pushed toward the boardroom above it. She pushed, and the napkin in Henry's pocket moved with her. Folded tight, ink-stained, signed, still there. She heard the boardroom before she saw it. Muffled voices. The specific self-important murmur of men in expensive suits deciding things that would affect people they had never met. The sound filtered down through the floor above, through the concrete and the ductwork and the years of insulation, and arrived in the stairwell as something formless and low. A vibration more than a sound, the feeling of power conducting itself through solid material. Sarah stopped at the top of the staircase. 9:55 a.m. She knew the time because Henry had told her 3 minutes ago, checking the watch on his right wrist. A simple watch. Stainless steel, no diamonds, the kind a man buys because it tells time and for no other reason. She had noticed it down in the tunnel and had thought, without bitterness, simply as an observation, that there were two kinds of people who wore watches in this building, the kind that wore them to be seen, and the kind that wore them to know what time it was. 5 minutes. They had 5 minutes before the vote was called. The service door was directly in front of her, steel heavy, set into the concrete wall of the stairwell landing. At the base of the door, a thin line of light, boardroom-level light, warm and electric, leaking under the frame. Sarah reached for her key ring. She found the right key. She knew it by shape, by weight, by the particular way it sat between her fingers. She had never used this one before, but she had cataloged it. 3 years and 4 months of cataloging, of learning what opened what, in a building that most people only ever experienced as a surface. She inserted the key. She turned it. Nothing. She turned it again, harder. The key moved in the cylinder but found no purchase, no give, no click of tumblers releasing. She withdrew it. She reinserted it. She applied pressure in 3 different directions, the way you do when a lock is swollen from humidity or temperature change or years of disuse. Nothing. She stepped back. She looked at the door. Specifically, she looked at the lock. Not a standard maintenance lock, a padlock. Heavy, external, iron-bodied, the kind bolted through a hasp that had been added to the door after the original construction. Old iron, rusted at the shackle. Completely, absolutely immovable by any key on her ring. Gone. Every key she had. Every door in this building. Not this one. She stood in the stairwell and felt the floor go out from under her. Not physically. The other way. The internal way, the way the ground disappears when you have spent everything you had to give and arrived at a locked door anyway. Her job was gone. She had left the radio on the floor. She had pushed 300 pounds through a pitch-black maintenance tunnel on torn fingernails and burning calves. She had descended a staircase backwards in the dark. She had made every decision a person makes when they have chosen someone else's survival over their own security, and she had made every one of those decisions without hesitation. And she was standing in a concrete stairwell at 9:55 in the morning with a padlocked door between her and the only thing that made any of it mean something. From Henry's chest, a sound. Small, irregular. A soft, stuttering beep from the medical alert monitor clipped to the inside of his coat. 1 beat. Silence. 1 beat. 2 quick beats close together. Erratic. She looked at him. His color had changed. Not dramatically, not the theatrical pallor of a man collapsing in a film. Subtly, The way color changes in a face when the body is spending resources it doesn't have left to spend. His jaw was set. His hands on the armrests had tightened. "I'm fine," he said. "You're not," she said. "I'm fine enough," he said, precisely deliberately, the distinction of a man who has learned to negotiate with his own body. She turned back to the door. She pressed her palm flat against it. Cold steel. The padlock hung from the hasp on the right side, solid and indifferent. She grabbed it. She pulled. She felt the shackle hold with the complete bored certainty of iron that has never once been asked to fail. You play by their rules. You break your back in the dark. You follow every procedure and log every hour and show up on time every night for 3 years and 4 months. And the system still builds a locked door you can't open. The system always builds a locked door you can't open, and then it stands on the other side of it and calls itself fair. She had thought that before, in different rooms, at different hours. She had thought it about medical bills and child care costs and minimum wage and the gap between what a building costs to run and what the people who run it are paid to do it. She had thought it, and she had pushed the thought down, and she had gone back to work. She was not going back to work. She looked down. Her flashlight was in her left hand, heavy, brass-bodied, 8 inches long. A maintenance flashlight built for durability, built to take drops and impacts, and the general violence of being used by people doing physical labor in dark spaces. She had carried it for 3 years. She knew exactly how much it weighed. She looked at the padlock. She looked at the flashlight. She looked at the padlock again, specifically at the shackle, at the arc of iron connecting one side of the lock body to the other, at the rust gathered in the joint where the shackle met the housing. Rust meant age. Rust meant brittleness. Rust meant that the iron which had looked so certain and so permanent a moment ago had been quietly, slowly losing the argument with time for years before she arrived. Above her through the floor, the murmur of the boardroom sharpened. A voice, singular, authoritative, the kind of voice trained over a lifetime to sound like the closing of a door. Donald's voice. She couldn't make out the words. She didn't need the words. She needed 30 more seconds. She gripped the flashlight by its head. She raised it. She was very tired, and her hands were torn, and her back was a sustained red note of pain, and she raised it anyway. Donald Sterling raised his pen to the documents on the mahogany table. 20 executives watched. The vote was ready. The pension fund of 4,000 people sat in a folder to his left, waiting to be redirected, liquidated, consumed. He did not know what was in the stairwell below him. He did not know what was about to come through the door. Sarah brought the flashlight down. The shackle broke on the third strike, not dramatically, not with an explosion of sparks or a cinematic crack that echoed through the building. It broke the way old iron breaks when the rust has been winning for years. A dull, dense snap like a branch too dry to bend. The padlock dropped. It hit the concrete landing in 2 pieces. Sarah caught the hasp before it could swing back against the door and make noise. She stood still. She listened. Above her, the boardroom murmur continued unchanged. No pause. No footsteps moving toward the door. She looked at Henry. He nodded once. She gripped the door handle. She turned it. She pushed. The door opened into light. Warm, electric conference room light flooding the stairwell landing so suddenly that she had to blink. The smell changed instantly, from cold concrete and machine grease to carpet and recycled air and the specific scent of a room full of people who had been sitting in it for 40 minutes. Coffee. Paper. The faint chemical note of a presentation screen running hot. She didn't hesitate. She pushed the wheelchair through. The boardroom was large. 20 feet of polished mahogany table running down the center, flanked on each side by executive chairs in dark leather. 20 people in those chairs. 20 faces that turned in unison toward the service door that had just opened in the wall behind the head of the table. 20 faces that registered in sequence. Surprise, confusion, and then from most of them a kind of frozen blankness. The blankness of people who have spent their careers in rooms where everything is controlled and are confronted suddenly with something that is not. A janitor. In a torn apron, waterlogged canvas sneakers, dried tunnel grime on both forearms. pushing a wheelchair containing a man in a ruined cashmere coat. The silence was absolute. Breathless total, the kind of silence that has weight. Donald Sterling was at the head of the table. He had been mid-sentence. His mouth was still open. His left hand was flat on the mahogany surface, steadying a stack of tabbed legal documents. His right hand held a pen, uncapped. The pen he had been about to use to sign the first document in the stack. He closed his mouth. He stared. Then his face rearranged itself. The shock compressed, hardened, became something else. Something practiced and familiar and deeply ugly. "What," he said slowly, precisely, "is this?" Not a question. A verdict. The tone of a man who believes that the category a person belongs to is more relevant than anything they might have to say. Sarah pushed Henry to the foot of the table. She stopped the wheelchair. She stood behind it, both hands still on the handles, and she looked at Donald Sterling across 20 feet of polished wood and 30 years of accumulated power. She didn't speak. Henry spoke. "Hello, Donald," he said. His voice in the conference room was a different instrument than it had been in the tunnel. Unhurried, resonant, the voice of a man who had run this company from a standing position for decades and was running it now from a wheelchair in a ruined coat, and intended everyone in the room to understand that the coat was irrelevant. Donald's face went through something fast and involuntary, a flicker, there and gone. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. "No," Henry said. "I'm not." He let that sit for exactly 1 second. That was rather the point, wasn't it? Donald set the pen down. He straightened. He looked at Sarah with the expression he had worn in the terminal corridor at midnight, the flat, dismissive assessment of a man looking at something beneath his notice. It was the same look, identical. The only difference was the room and the audience. "Officer Sullivan," Donald said, not looking away from Sarah. His voice was controlled, executive-level controlled, the kind of calm that is a performance of calm rather than the thing itself. "This woman is trespassing in a restricted corporate space. I need her removed." Matthew Sullivan was standing near the door on the far side of the room. He had been there when Sarah entered. She had seen him immediately. He was in the same uniform he had been wearing at midnight. He looked at Donald. He looked at Sarah. He looked at Henry. He did not move. "Officer Sullivan," Donald said again, sharper now, a blade behind it. Matthew stayed where he was. Something had settled in his face. Something that had not been there at midnight in the corridor when he had found a very convenient interest in the middle distance. Sarah reached into her apron pocket. She pulled out the napkin, crumpled, stained thin, a coffee shop napkin that had spent the night folded in an apron pocket and the morning folded in a cashmere coat. She held it by one corner and she walked slowly the length of the mahogany table. Her sneakers made soft sounds on the boardroom carpet. She was aware of every eye in the room tracking her. 20 executives motionless, watching a woman in a torn apron walk toward the head of their table. She set the napkin down in front of Donald Sterling. She stepped back. She folded her hands. Donald looked at the napkin. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he doesn't immediately understand and is working very hard not to let that show. He picked it up. He read it. The color left his face by degrees, starting at his jaw, moving upward. "This is nothing," he said. "This is a coffee napkin." "Turn it over," Henry said from the foot of the table. Donald turned it over. On the back, in Henry Sterling's handwriting, firm, deliberate, the hand of a man who had signed contracts and founded companies and had written this particular document by the light of a maintenance flashlight at 12:31 in the morning, witnessed by a woman whose name was printed clearly at the bottom in the same ink. A proxy transfer. A legal designation of voting authority. 51% of Henry Sterling's controlling shares temporarily assigned, signed, dated, time-stamped, and witnessed. Witnessed by Sarah Mitchell. Donald set the napkin down. He set it down very carefully. His hands, Sarah noticed, were not entirely steady. "A napkin," he said. "You can't. This is not a legal document. This is a piece of garbage from a coffee shop." "I'd like to hear that argument in front of a judge," Henry said mildly. Given that I drafted the company's original proxy provisions myself and am intimately familiar with what they require. He paused. Signed, dated, witnessed. The witness present in this room available to testify. Another pause, a shorter one. You may want to put the pen down, Donald. Donald did not put the pen down. His jaw was locked. His eyes moved from the napkin to Henry to Sarah to the napkin again. The calculation behind his eyes was visible, the rapid, cornered arithmetic of a man trying to find an exit that isn't there. Sarah looked at him across the mahogany table. She was terrifyingly calm. Not the calm of someone who had nothing at stake. The calm of someone who has already lost everything that could be taken and is therefore at last completely free. You thought a mop bucket, she said, was the most important thing in the room. Donald Sterling stared at her. The napkin sat on the polished mahogany between them. Coffee-stained, crumpled ink bled at the signature line. The most important piece of paper in the building, sliding slowly in the air-conditioning draft toward the center of the table. The room waited. 20 executives. One paralyzed billionaire in a ruined coat. One janitor with torn fingernails and wet canvas sneakers. One security officer who had made his choice and was standing in it. And Donald Sterling at the head of his father's table holding a pen he no longer had the authority to use. Henry Sterling looked at the room, not at Donald, at the room, at the 20 faces arranged along the mahogany table like a jury that had not yet been asked to vote. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, measured unhurried, the voice of the room's original architect, I would like to call the vote. Donald moved first, fast the way cornered men move, without strategy, on instinct. He stepped sideways, putting himself between Henry and the center of the table, his hand coming down flat on the stack of legal documents as though physical contact with them transferred some additional authority. This is over, he said. Whatever this is. Whatever you think you've done. His eyes cut to Sarah. Briefly, then back to the room. The proxy transfer is unenforceable. It's written on a napkin. It has no legal standing. I want corporate counsel on the phone right now, and I want this woman, Donald. Henry's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It simply occupied the room fully the way a voice does when it has been the final word in that room for 3 decades. Sit down. Donald did not sit down, but he stopped talking. The silence that followed was different from the silence when the door had opened. That silence had been shock. This silence was the specific loaded quiet of a room waiting to see which way the weight falls. Henry reached into his coat. He withdrew the napkin. He held it up. Coffee-stained ink bled soft from being folded and refolded through the longest night in the building's history. He held it the way a man holds something he knows is sufficient. The proxy transfer was executed at 12:31 this morning. He said, in Terminal 4 of this airport under the provisions of Article 7 of Vanguard Aviation's founding charter, which I drafted myself in 1994 and which requires only a witnessed signature and a stated date to be binding. He set the napkin on the table. He pressed 2 fingers to it flat. The witness is present. The signature is mine. The date and time are printed by the pen, which is a pressurized ballpoint that stamps a micro timestamp in the ink compound. He looked at the room. It is, I assure you, enforceable. The silence changed again, a different texture, the sound of 20 people doing rapid private arithmetic. Donald's face had gone through something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear, but lived in the territory between them. His jaw was set, his hand was still on the documents. You can't give a janitor 51%, he said. The word landed in the room like something he intended as a weapon. It didn't land that way. Several of the faces along the table shifted. One woman, 4th from the left, looked at her hands. Henry looked at his son for a long moment. The look of a man who has spent the night arriving at a conclusion he had been resisting for years. I just did, he said. Henry turned to Sarah. She was standing behind the wheelchair, both hands on the handles exactly where she had been since she pushed through the door. She had not moved toward the table. She had not moved toward Donald. She had stood and waited and let the room come to its own accounting. Ms. Mitchell, Henry said, the vote before this board is a motion to liquidate the employee pension fund and redirect assets to a private holding structure. You hold 51% of the controlling shares temporarily assigned under Article 7. He paused. How do you vote? Every face in the room turned to Sarah. She stood in her torn apron. She stood in her duct tape sneakers. She stood with tunnel grime on her forearms and torn fingernails and the physical record of a night that had cost her everything she'd had and several things she hadn't known she was carrying. She looked at Donald Sterling. He looked back at her. In his eyes, behind the calculation and the fury, something else. Small raw, the thing that lives beneath contempt when the contempt finally stops working. No, Sarah said. One word. Flat, clean, final. The vote was cast. The room exhaled. What happened next happened quickly, in the way that collapses happen quickly once the weight shifts. 3 board members spoke at once, then deferred to each other, then reached a consensus in under 90 seconds. Corporate counsel was reached by phone. The lockdown on the VIP elevators was lifted. 2 members of the board's internal audit committee moved immediately to freeze the holding structure Donald had established 3 months prior pending review. And the doors on the far side of the room opened. 2 federal agents. Dark suits credentials already in hand, the particular unhurried purposefulness of people who have been waiting in a building for the outcome of a vote. They had been waiting since 8 a.m. Henry had made a phone call on the night of his abandonment. Not from his dead wheelchair, but earlier before Donald had come. A contingency, a backup plan authored by a man who had built a company by preparing for the failure of every plan. They moved to either side of Donald Sterling. Donald looked at the agents. He looked at his father. He looked at the napkin on the table, still sitting where Henry had placed it, still marked with the timestamp, the signature, the witness name. He looked at Matthew Sullivan. Matthew Sullivan walked across the boardroom carpet with the even deliberate tread of a man who has made a decision and is done deliberating about it. He unclipped the handcuffs from his belt. He had carried them since midnight. He had stood 10 feet away from a man kicking a mop bucket and said nothing, and he had carried them through the rest of the night, and now he used them. The cuffs went over Donald's right wrist first. The steel clicked, closed, then the left wrist. The steel closed again directly over the $50,000 Rolex, the clasp of the cuff pressing flat against the watch face. Cold steel. Over-warm gold. The sound it made was small, precise, final. Donald Sterling's Italian leather loafers squeaked on the marble as the agents guided him toward the door. Not a dignified sound. The sound of expensive things reduced to traction to basic friction, to the simple physics of a man being moved from one place to another against his will. He was taken through the door he had walked through 100 times as the most powerful person in the room. He did not look back. Henry Sterling sat in his wheelchair at the foot of the table and watched his son leave. His face was composed, not satisfied, not grieved, the expression of a man who has closed an account that should have been closed much earlier and is living in the specific, complicated quiet of being right too late. He turned to Sarah. "I would like to offer you a position," he said. "Vice President of Operations. You will have authority over every facility in this company. Compensation commensurate with the role and full benefits effective immediately." He looked at her steadily. "You know where every door in this building is. You know which ones open and which ones don't. That knowledge is worth considerably more than we have been paying you for it." Sarah looked at him. She looked at the boardroom, the 20 faces, some still recalibrating, some already nodding, the mahogany table, the water glasses, the stack of legal documents that would now be filed differently than they had been arranged to be filed this morning. She looked at the napkin. She looked at Donald's chair empty at the head of the table, the pen still uncapped beside the untouched documents. She thought about Marcus, about a 7-year-old who wanted to be a pilot, about what it meant to come home in the morning and tell him that the floor you stood on was not the ceiling. "Yes," she said. The room settled. Not dramatically. The way rooms settle after a long night, quietly with the particular exhaustion of a space that has held something large and is now holding something smaller and more durable. A board member near the center of the table reached for the water pitcher. The presentation screen on the far wall powered down. Someone opened a laptop. The work of the morning redirected began. Sarah looked at the floor near the door. A thin trail of mud tracked in during the commotion. Donald's shoes, his immaculate Italian leather loafers, dragged through the same tunnel grime she had pushed Henry through in the dark. She looked around the room, found what she was looking for, leaning against the wall beside the service door where she had left it when she came through. The handle of a mop. The building's not hers. A floor-standing model, the industrial kind left by the night cleaning crew. She picked it up. She walked to the door. She held it out across the threshold into the corridor where Donald had been taken. "You missed a spot," she said. No one in the room laughed, not because it wasn't earned, because some things land too precisely for laughter. Because sometimes the last word is so exactly the right word that the only response is silence and recognition, and the quiet understanding that the woman holding the mop is never again going to be the one who cleans the floor. She was going to be the one who decides who does. Fiction. But that feeling, knowing your dignity, is worth more than any title they can throw at you. I can't stand people who think a bank account makes them better than a hard worker. If you had the proxy vote to destroy the man who mocked your poverty, would you show mercy or drop the hammer? Drop a comment. Like, share, subscribe.